Welcome back to the Donkey Vote Political Podcast. Today we have the honor of having the former minister under in the Morrison ministry, Paul Fletcher, to join us today. Paul, thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you, Francis.
Yeah. So I'm assuming most of our viewers today have a little bit of an idea of who you are, Paul, as you had a pretty major role in the Morrison ministry before the 2022 election. But if you could give our viewers a little bit of a brief description of who you are before we get into the questions, that would be awesome.
No worries. So presently I'm what's called Manager of Opposition Business, and I'm Shadow Minister for Science, Arts, Government Services and the Digital Economy. In the Morrison government years, I was Minister for Urban Infrastructure, Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts from 2019 to 2022. So I worked on things like National Broadband Network, new roads and railways around the country, and of course trying to get the arts sector through the pandemic, which was quite challenging.
Great. So we'll now get started with our questions. So our first question is, how was your high school and university life, and do you have any memorable moments?
Look, at high school, I was somebody who mainly focused on English and history. In fact, I didn't do any maths in year 12. I was very involved in debating. I went to Sydney Grammar School, so I was very lucky with the school I went to, very involved in debating. I was involved in things like the school magazine, and played soccer not very well, and basketball even worse.
Weren't much of a sporting kid?
No, not really. At university, I kept up with debating, and I was lucky enough to go to inter-varsity debating competitions in Adelaide, in Melbourne, in Auckland, in New York, and in Dublin. I went to 2 World Inter-Varsity debating competitions. I was very involved in student politics. So I was on the Students' Representative Council at Sydney University and on the union board. And I got very involved in law reviews, stage shows, not the ones involving writing learned articles. And one of the guys I did that with, Peter Duncan, went on to make that a career, and he was the sort of guiding force behind the ABC TV show Rake. So he wrote a lot of the episodes of Rake, directed several of them, and he's been a professional film and TV writer and director for a long time. So I managed to do some fun stuff at uni, as well as getting to lectures from time to time.
And I think I also read somewhere that you got a perfect ATAR. Is that correct? Or
not quite. No, I was lucky enough to be Dux of Sydney Grammar School, and so I think I got an award for the highest HSC mark of anybody going into the arts faculty at Sydney University. So that's about the only objective piece of data I can point to. For some reason that year there was no official ranking produced, but yeah, I was lucky enough to do okay. I got the mark I needed to get into art first.
Yeah, I mean that's all you really need, basically. It doesn't matter what kind of grade you get if you just get into the course you want to do. You're kind of golden at that point. Yeah. So we'll get on to our second question. So I think you did touch on this a bit, but just to touch on your university life again, you wrote 2 plays while at Sydney University, I believe.
Yeah, so I mentioned that I was heavily involved in law reviews for several years, and there was a group of about 3 or 4 of us, including, as I mentioned, Peter Duncan, who essentially wrote a series of reviews, comedy skits and so on. And then we did a couple of professional productions in the first year or 2 out of law school. The first one was called Facts of Life. It was at the Playhouse at Sydney Opera House. It bombed spectacularly, lost a lot of money. Not many people went to see it. But actually there was a guy who came in, who was appointed as the director to sort of rescue it after it was such a disaster, and he did quite a good job. And he then said to us, well, let's do another review. And we did one at the Stables Theatre in Darlinghurst. And that was called Annually Fixated. And it was a show about, the different stages of each year, public holidays and and different markers of time. And that one went quite well, actually. That was good fun. But by that time, certainly I was getting too involved in my work as a young lawyer. And so we had the opportunity to do more, but some of us did, some of us didn't, I'm sorry to say. But it was very educational. I tell you, 20 plus, or probably 30 years later when I was arts minister, it was pretty useful to have gone through the experience of being involved effectively as the co-producer of a stage show that had lost a lot of money. That was very informative.
Did you ever think about getting into directing or into that sort of field during that stage?
Look, I toyed with the idea. Later on, as I mentioned, I was also involved in a lot of university debating, and I worked with a couple of others, and we pitched an idea to Channel 9 called, I think it was called Super Debates. It was based on, the Super Test cricket, a similar idea. And there was a series of that which ran, I think that was probably about 1997 or 8. I think there were 4 televised debates. So I kind of have had dabbled a little bit in those kinds of things, but always ended up going off and doing more serious things.
Yeah. And also just to touch on a bit as well, you did a MBA at Columbia University, is that correct? Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I was at Columbia in New York in 93 to 95. So Columbia is Upper West Side of Manhattan. It runs the campus, the center of the campus is 116th Street between Amsterdam Avenue and Broadway. And look, it was just a great experience. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship, a Fulbright scholarship to go there. And it was just very, very enjoyable. New York's such an incredibly dynamic city. A lot of Americans doing the course, but a lot of people from around the world as well. And I guess it opened my eyes up to a bunch of things I hadn't really thought about before. In particular, it was probably why I got really interested in the whole communications sector. I took a course called Management of Media, Information and Communications, taught by a guy called Professor Eli Noem, who was a bit of a world guru. And in 1993, in Australia, we still only had Telstra. Its name had just changed from Telecom to Telstra, but it was pretty much the only phone company. There were a couple of small competitors. It was pretty much the only one. Hardly anybody had a mobile phone. They were kind of a luxury item. The internet didn't exist as a consumer phenomenon. There was no pay television. And so to get to the US and start to learn about the internet, to be somewhere where pay television had been going for 30 or 40, 50 years, where competition in telecommunications had really taken off, it just opened up my eyes to a whole lot of things. And I decided that I wanted to come back to Australia, and I wanted to work in either transport or communications. So I ended up spending a year working at TNT, which was then a big transport company in Australia, in a corporate strategy team, worked there for a year. And then the Liberal Party won government, and I had the chance to go and work for the then Minister for Communications, Senator Richard Alston. So I ended up working for him for nearly 4 years. And definitely, I think, having done the MBA was what had got me so interested in the communications sector, and was kind of led me to the next steps that I took.
Yeah. Also, that does kind of touch on our next question that I have for you. Actually, it is a recording from Tobias, so I'll just play it now, actually.
Yeah.
Just let me know if can you see the video?
I can see the video? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just turn it up so you can hear it.
Paul, you spent some time in the private sector, especially 8 years on the senior management team for Optus. Could you talk a bit about your experience working in the private sector? Also, if you could talk about your opinion on the most recent Optus breaches.
Yeah, that's the question.
Okay, so thanks, Tobias. You asked me about my time in the private sector, in particular at Optus. So after I'd been with the Minister for Communications for 4 years, I took what's a pretty common transition to then go and work in the sector where I'd had some involvement as a political staffer. And so I went to work for Optus in the role of Director of Corporate and Regulatory Affairs. And I had a team of about 60 people. So that included the legal team, the media relations team, internal communications, and then very importantly, what's called interconnect. So this is the process of commercially negotiating with other telcos the terms on which you buy and sell services from them, and particularly Telstra. At the time, Optus was Telstra's largest customer. That may very well be true still today, I'm not sure. I also had the regulatory affairs team and the government relations team. So it was a very busy time. One of the first things I got involved in when I was at Optus was the company was in the course of being bought by Singtel. So we had to get government approval under the Foreign Investment Review Board process. And we also had to get approval from the US government because the change in ownership of the Optus satellites required approval from what's called the Office of Defence Trade Controls in Washington, DC, because the satellites embody sensitive US technology. So that was quite an experience. I had to travel to Washington, DC a couple of times and meet with these officials. But I worked on also the restructuring of the pay TV sector. There had been, when Optus first started in about 1992, it had then taken a decision about 94, 95 to set up a pay TV business, which was called, I think it was called Optus Television. And you had Optus TV, you had Foxtel, and a decision was taken to try and merge those businesses together. So that was a very intense set of commercial negotiations. But overall, it was a really busy time and a very interesting time. And it turned out to be very useful then for when I subsequently became a politician working on communications issues, including as parliamentary secretary to Malcolm Turnbull when he was communications minister from 2013 to 2015. And then, of course, when I was communications minister myself from 2019 to 2022.
And you worked at Optus during the early 2000s, is that correct?
Yeah, that's
before
right.
You went into Parliament?
Tobias asked about the recent issues that Optus has had. And just in the last few weeks, the Optus network went down for quite a few hours. When the company explained what had happened, there was a problem with the routers, which, as the name suggests, are the devices which move internet traffic from the company that owns the routers to other parties in the internet. And what had happened was that there was a new set of routing tables uploaded. There was a failure or a problem with one of those tables. What can happen in that circumstance is that traffic then ceases to flow because the routing tables aren't accurate or are flawed in some way. And then other routers start to get excess traffic. So they then automatically switch off and you get a cascading effect across the network.
Yeah.
That, based upon what the company said subsequently, that looks to have happened. Now, no telco ever wants to have the network go down, and a lot of work and effort goes into trying to avoid that scenario. But sadly, from time to time, it does happen. In the last 10 years, there have been several instances of similar outages at other telcos. Telstra had one some years ago, and there are others as well. You know, it's interesting, if you look at the aftermath of what happened from that incident, there were quite a few politicians who were very quick to criticise, but there was no criticism coming from the other telcos because everybody in the industry knows, with the best will in the world, from time to time, these things sometimes happen. So it's an unfortunate incident. I know that people at Optus felt very bad about it because the whole ethos of a telco is to keep the network up, to keep people communicating, and they obviously worked very intensely to solve the problem, to find the problem and to solve it and get the network up as quickly as possible. But it's understandable that customers found it a very frustrating experience.
Yeah. I even know from some of my friends' experiences as well, like in Victoria, I think the whole metro trains network was shut down. A lot of people couldn't really get on their phones as well. It was a really, really difficult time a couple of weeks ago. So, and there were a lot of complaints towards Optus as well.
Indeed, and totally understandable. What it reminds us of is the fact that the internet and the digital economy rides on a physical network layer, and if there's a problem in the physical network, then you have a cascading series of consequences. So, you know, many of us don't use cash anymore. We pay using PayWave, but of course that all depends upon the network. Internet. And in the example you've given, you know, the communications networks that oversee how trains are running or other transport systems, again, right over the internet. 20 or 30 years ago, voice telephony was analog, but now it's digital, and it's IP. It's internet protocol. In other words, those packets of data that are racing between those routers all around Australia and all around the world are carrying data, and they're also carrying voice. And if there is a failure, then that means voice telephony stops working. So the internet has transformed the world, and in my view, in a hugely positive way, but it has also created a degree of vulnerability because we all depend so much now on being connected all the time.
Exactly. I think the internet, I do agree with you there as well. The internet is such a pivotal part of our lives, and it has improved our lives in such a greater way. Like, you know, we can connect with people from all across the world. While back in the day, like, you know, this interview right now, because of the internet is happening, like back 50, 60 years ago, I would have had to taken a flight to Sydney to come and speak to you, Paul. So it has changed the world. But I think that overall dependency is really, really big. And, you know, when the internet does go down, which sadly it does happen because, you know, the internet isn't perfect. Not many people, nothing in this world is perfect. So everything does break down eventually. Our dependency is so high on it that, you know, a lot of people are stuck doing nothing. And with metro trains, as I said before, like the whole system went down. So no trains were running, and it was just all a kerfuffle.
Yeah, so it is a good example of how everything is so interconnected today.
Yeah. We'll now get on to the fourth question that we have for you, Pauls. So you also worked for a consulting firm called Fletcher Group Advisors, which I believe you founded. Could you talk to us a bit about your work in this firm?
Yeah, I set up a consultancy business because I felt, having had quite a long time in the telco industry, that I'd build up a sufficiently strong personal brand that I would be able to attract work and do consultancy work across a range of companies in the telco sector and in other regulated industries. My slogan was strategic counsel to regulated industries. And I ended up doing that for nearly 2 years. The work started to come in very quickly as soon as I set up the business. I did some work with others, did some subcontracting work, did some work in consortiums with others. And my plan was to build up the business over a number of years, you know, to have a number of professionals in the business. But what happened was the opportunity came up to contest pre-selection for the Liberal seat at Bradfield. And so that happened more quickly than I'd expected, because Brendan Nelson, who had been the leader of the opposition and was the member for Bradfield, lost the leadership, spent a few months thinking about what he was going to do, and then decided he was going to leave the parliament. And so what that resulted in was a by-election occurring much more quickly than might otherwise have occurred. And so the Liberal Party needed to pre-select a candidate very quickly. As soon as that was announced, I saw that that was a very, very good opportunity for anybody wanting to get into Parliament, as I was. So I put the business on hold, contested the pre-selection, won the pre-selection, and within about 2 months I was in the Parliament, so I had to shut the business down.
So the business it's not in existence anymore.
No, it's not.
Oh, maybe that's something you do after politics.
Potentially.
Not going to rule it out.
In this game, you never rule anything out.
Exactly. So you did touch on your by-election, going into the by-election there for Bradfield, that actually comes across to our next question that Tobias has as well. So I'll just play it again. I'll continue the video.
And my next question is, what made you run in the 2009 election for the seat of Bradfield and joined the Liberal Party?
Yes, I think the question was what caused me to contest the 2009 by-election. Is that right?
And also, what made you join the Liberal Party specifically as well?
Okay, so I had joined the Liberal Party when I was at high school. I got very interested in politics when I was in about year 9 or 10. I was interested in history, and I guess I'd been reading about political history in Australia and other countries, and I just decided I was going to join the Liberal Party, so I joined the Young Liberals. When I was on campus, I was, as I mentioned earlier, very involved in student politics. I was a member of the Liberal Club. I ran for the Student Representative Council as a Liberal student. I was involved in what's called ALSF, Australian Liberal Students Federation. And so I'd been a member of the Liberal Party all of that time and been a volunteer member and, helped to campaign, hand out how to vote on election day and all that kind of thing. And I'd always had in the back of my mind that perhaps if an opportunity came up, I might contest a pre-selection and seek to become a parliamentarian. So what had happened was that in 2007, Bruce Baird, who was the member for Cook in the southern suburbs, announced that he was not going to run again. So I decided I would contest that pre-selection, and there was quite a distinguished field because amongst the other candidates was Scott Morrison, also Mark Speakman, who is now the New South Wales Leader of the Opposition, David Coleman, who is now in the Commonwealth Parliament as a member for Banks and is the Shadow Minister for Communications. So anyway, that pre-selection went ahead. I didn't win. I initially came second to somebody who was then knocked out by a state executive. The pre-selection was then reheld. The rules were changed. And I decided not to contest the second version of it, and Scott Morrison won it. The rest is history. But so then 2 years later, the opportunity came up in Bradfield, and that was when I decided to have another go. And the cards fell my way. There were 17 candidates in the pre-selection, but I was lucky enough to win it. And then in the by-election, which was held on December the 5th, 2009.
You remember the date?
There were, I think there were 21 candidates.
Oh.
So a lot of people were running. The Christian Democrats decided they were going to run 11 candidates, each of them under the Christian Democrats banner. Subsequently, the law was changed to say that only one candidate from any given party can be in a House of Representatives election. Their explanation, incidentally, as to why there were 11 candidates was they wanted to have one for every one of the disciples except Judas. That was their explanation. I think they made that up because they were planning to have 12, but then one pulled out.
I liked when you talked about there as well, the 2007 pre-selection for Cook. So, if things did fall your way and you did probably go on that second ballot, we could have a very different history. You might have been Prime Minister instead of Scott Morrison. Who knows?
That's possible, but I think not terribly likely. Scott was extremely effective from the moment he came into the Parliament. He was on the shadow. He was made a front bencher, I think, within about a year of coming to the Parliament. He very soon became Shadow Minister for Immigration, and he was extremely effective in that role and was really a critical player within a year or so of coming to Parliament. Not many people managed to progress at quite the rate that Scott did, but he is a very talented politician.
Yeah, he's basically the main reason why the boat people stopped. So that was all because of him, really, in that whole immigration policy. Yeah. We'll now move on to our sixth question. So, who would you say is your political role model / idol?
There's probably a couple. Winston Churchill, I think, who had the most extraordinary political career, which lasted for many decades, and of course was instrumental to Britain staying in the fight in World War II, and was frankly instrumental to Western democracies and the values that Western democracies embody prevailing over the evil of totalitarianism. He's also a master of the English language. I like to quote one of his many aphorisms when he said of democracy that it is the worst system of government except for all the others, by which he meant that it's very messy and human with all the flaws that come with that, but nevertheless it's so much better than
authoritarianism.
Yeah, totalitarianism and so on. And look, in the Australian context, John Howard, because he was methodical, determined, tenacious, and provided good and stable government for a long time as Prime Minister, in addition to his contributions as Treasurer and in other ministerial roles in the Fraser government. But the sort of sound economic policies that he delivered together with Treasurer Costello have really set Australia up for a very long time. And it was one of those things, I think, when the Australian people voted the Howard government out in 2007, they did so really thinking that you could take for granted good economic management, particularly because Kevin Rudd sought to portray himself as he was going to be just like that nice Mr. Howard on economics. He was going to be just a little bit more progressive on other issues. It turned out that he was completely hopeless on economics and, rather chaotic in the way that he organised things. But in any event, I would certainly identify John Howard as the role model I'd look to in Australian politics.
Yeah. I did. Yeah. So a lot of Howard's policies around economics are really strong. One of the policies actually that kind of relates a bit to me as well was the whole grants that were given to newborn children, especially those who were born in that 2000 range. Because I'm actually born in 2006, so I was born during the time Costello was Treasurer. So my mum and dad always tell me that when I was born, they received a $2,000 grant from the government because of that. And I remember one of the key things that Costello always talked about was he wanted, because even nowadays our birth rate is drastically really low, and it is a really big issue that I don't think many people are really talking about. Like, our birth rate's below replacement, so I think it's around that 1.7 range, and it's supposed to be above 2.1 or higher. And Costello during that Peter Costello during that time as Treasurer really pushed towards increasing the birth rate. So he had that saying, you have one kid to pay for the father's pension, one kid to pay for the mum's pension, and then the third child is for the country. So yeah, those are some economic policies that I like as well from the Howard years.
Yeah, it was an important statement by the government of the day to encourage families, couples, to have children, and also a recognition that it's hard work being parent. It's demanding emotionally, it's demanding financially. Of course, it's enormously rewarding as well. But I think the point that Peter Costello was seeking to make was it's important to families personally to have children, but it's also important for the nation, and there can be a great tendency to kind of take that for granted. And the aim, certainly the Howard government policy settings, were all about encouraging people to have children.
Yeah, and I noticed there as well you didn't name because we've interviewed a lot of politicians, and one of the most common ones is the founder of the Liberal Party, Robert Menzies. So it's interesting that of course you probably see him as a role model as well, wouldn't you? But he's probably one of my favorite prime ministers of all time. So yeah.
Yeah, and obviously an extraordinary figure in Australian history. And really, I think an example of the egalitarian nature of Australia. He was a very, very clever boy and man. and essentially on the strength of his abilities, he was able to become relatively quickly a very significant political figure, first within the then Victorian state government and then nationally. And again, John Howard rose quickly in politics through his own abilities. I think that openness and contestability in our system is something that is very important. And I think one of the great things about politics in Australia is it is open to anyone who wants to have a go. You don't have to be born into a political family. It's not like so many countries around the world where politics is sort of dynastic. That is really not true in Australia.
Exactly. I can even talk from experience as well. My mum is Filipino, so the current president of the Philippines is Bongbong Marcos, and his father was the dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. So, we are very lucky in Australia that, you don't have to come from a certain political background. You don't have to be, of a certain ethnic group. You don't have to have a certain last name to become a prime minister or to even be elected to parliament. It is all free. Anyone can run, whether you're a plumber, whether you're getting a 99.95 ATAR, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're just a union representative. Like, anyone can run in politics. So it's something that is really, really treasured in Australia. And one of the other things as well that I would like to comment as well on Menzies. One of the things I love about Robert Menzies is the fact that he had that respect towards his Labor colleagues. In myself, my political history actually on my dad's side is that my great-grandfather and grandfather were both Labor members, and they split off in 1955 with the DLP split. So my great-grandfather and grandfather knew a lot of the Labor politicians before the 55 split. So Arthur Calwell, Ben Chifley, and a lot of the Victorian Labor politicians. So Ned Hogan, who was the Premier during that time, John Cain Sr., those sort of politicians. So, but the thing I do love about Menzies is the fact that during that time, even though Ben Chifley and Arthur Calwell, for example, were opposing a lot of his policies and that sort of thing, he still had that respect, and that's that sort of respect towards his opposition. And you can even tell, like, after he retired, he still kept in contact with Arthur Calwell, and they were great mates. And when Ben Chifley died, I think the Australian put out a really good article on it. He was visibly emotional at Ben Chifley's funeral, even though they were supposed to be, political hard nuts going against each other. There was still that sort of respect and that sort of camaraderie together, even though they were from opposing parties.
Yes.
Yeah. So we'll now move on to our final question. So finally, what's one piece of advice you'd give to students in 2024, especially those who are entering university or high school?
Well, I think I don't have anything particularly original or insightful to say, but my observation would be, when I look at, say, my peer group, people I went through uni with, people I went through law school with, people I went to high school with, those who seem to have enjoyed their working life the most are people who pursued something that really interested them, and often an indicator of what interested them was the things they did as a hobby or as an interest, as an extracurricular activity. And then if they were able to turn that into a job, that was a really good outcome. I mentioned my mate Peter Duncan, who has been a writer and director. I should emphasise, by the way, that Pete's politics are probably rather different to mine, but I've got a lot of respect for the journey that he's taken. But I can think of plenty of other people I was at law school with or at high school with who have pursued passions. On the other hand, there are people who chose to take a particular job because it was high paying, and it's all been a bit of a grind. So my essential observation would be, don't choose what you do on the basis of what's going to pay you the most money. Choose what you do on the basis of what is most interesting and engaging to you. That's probably going to end up being the thing where you do best and will also therefore be reflected in your remuneration. But, you know, it's pretty soul destroying to spend 20 or 30, 40 years of your life doing something you don't particularly enjoy, and, you know, just because that's what you chose because of the money or because you thought it was more prestigious or anything like that. So again, I don't pretend any of that is original or insightful, but
Pretty
I would
insightful.
say that, well, looking at my group of friends and peers and colleagues, the ones who've been able to pursue their passions, I'm not saying it's easy, it's definitely not, but I think what it means is you perhaps have a greater sense of purpose in the work you're doing and ultimately a greater sense of fulfillment out of it.
Exactly. You know, as they say, you know, if you're not enjoying what you're doing, it's not it. If you're not enjoying what you're doing, it's going to be more of a strain and a struggle to do it. It's going to be more of a chore rather than a hobby.
Yeah.
So that's why I think it's always important, even if, you know, you're earning less money compared to your friends, if you're enjoying what you're doing, you know, no wage or no salary is going to ever. How do I put this? Like, even if you're earning 200K a year, but you're doing a job that you just don't want to do, I'd rather be the person earning 60K doing something that I love doing.
Yeah, I think that's wise, and you know, the start of starting uni, thinking about career choices. You know, there are lots of choices that are available to all of us in the modern world. It can be easy to get a bit overwhelmed by that and think, oh, if I choose this, have I made a mistake by not doing that? The other thing that I would certainly observe that I've seen in my own career choices I've made, and that so many other people, you know, I was at high school or uni with, is you do different things. You're not locked into the one thing you choose at a particular point in time. Most people move from area to area to area. There's usually what you've done in one area helps you to get to the next thing, but it's quite unusual for people in today's modern economy to spend 30 or 40 years doing exactly the same thing. So people who are kind of stressing about what choice do I make, I would say don't overthink that, because nothing is definitive. You're not locking yourself into a particular course of action for the next 10, 20, 30 or 40 years.
Exactly. Even here in Victoria, with the Andrews Allen Labor government's investment in TAFE, you know, and with 2 years free 2 years free no HECS debt for those studying for teaching. There's so many other career pathways nowadays, like especially from your time, Paul, when you went to university. I don't think you would have imagined the way university has changed in so many ways. Like, it's so easy now just to change courses, change careers. Like, it doesn't take that much. Like, if you're not enjoying your career, you can just go back to university and study something else. So
definitely, and there's lots of now, you know, 1-year master's courses for mid-career people. In fact, I was visiting Curtin University in WA. No, not Curtin. It was Edith Cowan University in WA. Visiting their cybersecurity people, and they were talking about the 1-year mid-career course they've got for people who want to work in cybersecurity. But you see that right across. There are so many fields where you can choose to go into another field and learn in an accelerated fashion through a master's, for example. So yeah, there are plenty of opportunities to do different things at different stages of life.
exactly, yeah. All right then. Those are all our questions for you, Paul. Thank you again for joining us. I realize it's 5 p.m., so the office is probably going to be closing soon, but I do really appreciate the time you've given us to answer these important questions for our viewers.
Thank you, Francis. It's been a pleasure.